first, thank you so much for coming here on this 2 p.m. And if you know of anybody who was wanting to come and couldn't come, I even got a text message earlier from a congregant who wanted to be here. As I said, I am recording these lessons to put up, to be sent out to our church and also on my YouTube page for people to catch themselves up. And the origin of this Bible course, which I really don't know how long it will go on for. I'm months and months as it spread out. It was originally conceived in conversations with David Bibler while we were sitting Wednesday morning for our men's Bible study. And he expressed just a genuine dissatisfaction with his own knowledge and comprehension of the Bible. Every now and again, I would mention a story that for me was like one of those Bible stories that I was steeped in. And, I can see BK now. Anyway, her video's up, that I was steeped in, and and he wouldn't know, and I found that to be pretty common. So David, if you're listening, don't beat yourself up. That's pretty common. People, especially in more recent decades, have found the Bible less and less accessible. And as we get in through this lesson, I think we'll discover some of the reasons why that might be the case. So I wanted to put together a 5-week course, originally was how I conceived it, to answer the questions: what is the Bible, who wrote it, how it has been understood in the past, and how it still speaks to us today. But as the plan morphed into an online venue, I realized that I had the freedom to really broaden that out and deepen it. I found myself lamenting things I was cutting out of my original outlines, and then I thought, why not just have my overarching goal still in place, but then spend more time touching on the themes that come up as we go. So next week, we will begin a more in-depth study of the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, really focusing on Genesis and then moving through that. But before we even get there, at the front half of the next week's lesson, we will talk about the different divisions of the Bible and how we came with those divisions, and when in history those certain kinds of books were written, different genres, of course, within the Bible. So our focus will be going narrow and then broad. And at times we'll get as specific as what the Bible means for the lives of, say, women. The few times there are stories about women in the Bible, how would those stories be heard by women, whether they were Black women during the Civil Rights era, or during slavery, or even women back when the Hebrew Bible was being put together, who were a very marginalized voice? How would they see themselves in different biblical characters like Sarah or Rahab? So I could go on in this way. I would like to bring up my PowerPoint here that I've comprised for this week's class. Let me know if you can see it. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. So what is the Bible? A study of what the Bible is, how it was put together, who wrote it, and how it has been understood through the ages, and how it may speak to us today. Now, I'm being a little tricky with this picture here, but I think that photo op with the Bible and the president brought to light the fact that people have strong opinions about what the Bible is and its place in society, even if their opinion is, I don't want to read the Bible and I don't really value it very much. There's still a reaction to a photo like this. And within Christian traditions, the reactions were widespread. And I think that your approach to a photo like this might reveal something about your own story as it relates to the Bible, and some of the things that you love about the Bible, or some of the baggage that is perhaps you carry as a result of your interactions with the Bible. And so I asked on Sunday, for those of you who are there, for you to begin to think about what your own Bible story is, what your story is in relation to the Bible. when did you first begin to engage the Bible, or when did you first begin to have questions about the Bible? And so I'll give a moment for those of you who would like to talk about that, share some of your thoughts in this moment, so I could better understand how you approach the Bible and what place it is held in your life. And so I'll open it up for discussion.
Well, I'm at the top. Sorry.
A long time ago, when I was not as tall as I am now, went to church every once in a while, and they were talking about the Bible, interesting stories, this and that. But that's when I started wondering how I lined those things up. But and that was about age 10. So I've given up on trying to get a line myself, because it just jumps back and forth, and everybody else is so much smarter than I am and know how it fits in on a timeline. But I've been interested for decades. Glad to be here.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Anyone else like to share?
I was brought up in an independent Christian church, and it was one of those that had on the wall the attendance for the day and the chapters read and that sort of thing. And in Sunday school, we always told how many chapters we'd read. And as a kid, I was searching for short chapters, of course. But my father was a Sunday school teacher, as was my grandmother. So I was kind of brought up with, this, but as I became an adult, I realized, yes, I've been to Sunday school, I've been to Vacation Bible School. You get different things, you memorize certain verses, but it just didn't kind of come together. It was hard for me to understand when I would read it. I partook in Bible study fellowship for about 7 years, and that gave me a much better understanding than I'd ever had before. And in the last 2 years, fact of the matter, Sue got me on to the Message Bible. I was kind of interested in the phrasing of it. So I bought one, and I had never really read the Old Testament. So I am plodding, and I say plodding, through the Old Testament. I am now into Micah, and I started in January of last year, 2019, and so I've gotten to Micah, and I've talked with Lester off and on about some things, and I just find it's very hard to read, but that was my goal, and it still is. I'm much more familiar with the New Testament, and I probably have read most of it at some time or other, but that's where I am. But there's still so much to be learned, no matter what.
I think that many people join you in your frustration, and sometimes what I heard both you and David say is that, you might read it, but pulling it all together into one sort of cohesive, maybe it doesn't exactly seem to always be on message, or at least be giving one message.
Well, all right. It tells the same story in 3 or 4 different books. And especially Old Testament.
Yes, it is.
You get, as you're reading along, you say, well, I've read that, I know that.
Yeah, it just keeps repeating.
it repeats a lot. And then you got your prophets who are prophesying about the same thing. And that's confusing to me. Because I guess when I'm reading something, what I wanted to do is kind of read something, and it'll say, okay, now also in 2 Chronicles, this same thing is covered, the very same thing, and the only thing different about it says this. But and it's the same way in the New Testament. A lot of times Paul is talking about the same thing. I think I've come across the same thing 3 times now, and each time there's something different about it. And I thought when I read it the first time I understood what Paul was saying. And then now I found these other verses and stuff. He's talking about the same thing, but he's not saying the same thing.
I
And
love
think
it.
that's what's so confusing is it's not, you can't group it together and get all the information you need at one time in one place.
I love that you're paying attention and noticing the discrepancies.
Mm-hmm.
We'll get into this later when we get into the books of history, but 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles are 2 tellings of the same events in Israel's history, except in one instance, it is the priestly class who are trying to defend the legitimacy of the existence of the priesthood as the sole authority in Israel. And in the other instance, in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, it's named Kings for a reason, they are trying to and also the same school compiled 1st and 2nd Samuel, they're trying to shore up the legitimacy of the monarchy. And so in their history telling, they had different objectives, but they're handling some cases of the same material, and in some cases they're handling 2 different tellings of the same material. And what you get really is this sort of, you turn to 1st Chronicles and you're like, wait a second, I swear this is almost word for word from what I was reading in 1st Kings. And that's the truth. In many cases it is at least in paraphrase form, if not direct quotations from the same sources that 1st and 2nd Kings were using. So we'll get into that. And the fact that you bring that up shows that you have not practiced the cognitive dissonance that we'll talk about later, where somebody who is wanting the Bible to speak in one voice and always be saying the same thing, they will just, it's possible to believe 2 things at the same time that are in conflict with one another. Human brains are talk to your son Jay about this. We were just talking about this last week, cognitive dissonance. Anyway, I'm rambling now, but love it. The purpose of this course is to give you some ways of approaching these Bible passages and some perspectives that will keep your mind from having to fold itself in half to hold it all in. Hey, BK, can you hear us now?
I can hear you, but I don't have you on the screen.
Okay, here I'm gonna send. That's wonderful. I was sending you a message earlier to let you know that
there's a bit. Is she on a laptop or phone?
No, I have a cell phone. I have an Android cell phone.
Okay.
And
I don't know about cell phones on the laptops. There's a little camera thing. If you press that, then you can see.
But I was sending you a text earlier, BK, that even if you can't see, this is being recorded, and so you'll be able to go back and see visually what you've missed visually. But
okay,
we'll work on getting you in full in the coming weeks or the next week.
okay.
Does anyone else have anything they'd like to add?
Yeah, I understand some of the comments made. I've always been a hit and miss reader, the scriptures, even though I'm a seminary graduate. And currently I decided that I'd take a shot at reading it straight through. Currently slogging my way through the Leviticus.
Good luck.
So from the comments, I'm assuming there's going to be some discussion of critical, oh boy, I can't think of the term now, but criticizing the critique of the writing within the scripture. There's a term for that that just goes away from me right now.
Biblical criticism.
Thank you.
Or sometimes literary biblical criticism. Yeah. And criticize here does not mean give negative comments on. It means to more analyze than to degrade. It means more to analyze. So, because I know criticism can have a negative connotation, and it doesn't carry that when we use it in terms of biblical criticism.
I just add one thing. When I was in high school and college, I belonged to a several different Christian student groups, and the one in high school had a Bible study that was really terrific, and ended up reading the New Testament a couple times because it was so thrilling to actually read it. But when I was in college, the student groups were pretty restrictive and proscriptive in their thinking, and they really wanted the answers to be the same. So if you went to a Bible study, you know, they had study guides, but everybody's answer had to be the same. And I found I opted out of those groups. In fact, I opted out of organized religion for a long time as a result of my participation in those groups. And then when I lived in New York, I had association with a Jewish community there, and I found out that they actually argue with each other about the meaning of the Torah and the Haftorah, and that was like, wow, they're like arguing. This is interesting. I kind of like this, and it was so refreshing and new, and so I kind of just put that away somewhere, and then my exposure to the Old Testament had been trying to read it on my own, couldn't get anywhere. But then in Lydia's circle, we had some lessons that were geared toward I think there were 2 years where we had lessons that were geared toward the Old Testament, and they were wonderful. I mean, it was probably the way the lessons were written, but it's like the first time that I got something out of Old Testament scripture, and that was really very nice. So those are just the things I wanted to share.
Sounds like many of you have been doing a lot of the work that this lesson today anticipates us needing to have done to come back into the scriptures and to find them life-giving. And well, at least for me personally, some people have never had the dilemma, but for me personally, I mirror and join you in a lot of the things that I'm hearing about the confusion and the frustration. And that'll become clear as next I'm about to share my own story with the Bible. But before I do, is there anyone else who'd like to share?
I'll say one thing. Every time, I won't say every time I read it, but most generally, I find something new in it.
Yes.
And that's what that's what stimulates me to want to go and read every day, to find something, to find out what's going to be new for me. This past week, I found out the one, if I'm saying it right, it's Isaiah 46, maybe 1960, something about that I am engraved upon the palm of God. And I thought, wow, I'm engraved upon the palm of God. And then there's my scripture verse, the one I wear all the time that's so special to me, is that I have called you by your name and you are mine. And so I just claim that verse. And that's what's so exciting about when you're reading the Bible. You come upon these gems that you did not know that were there. And they just refresh you and give you such hope and love, and it's a good feeling.
Isn't it something how even amidst confusion about some things in the Bible, you can still find these powerful moments where you're reading it devotionally, and it's as if God's Spirit finds you before your...
This past winter, I came up, now this is a Message translation. I realize it's a paraphrase. It's just a whole lot easier to read. But it's one of the Psalms. I don't remember which one it is right now. But it said that the clouds are flags of God's faithfulness. And this winter, it was so cloudy. Every day, it seemed like 90% of the time it was cloudy. And so every morning when I get up and I have my prayer time, I would say, thank you, God, for wrapping my world in your faithfulness. And if I didn't have that verse to go back to, I wouldn't have had that thought.
Wow.
Well,
thank you. Go ahead.
I have found too that I have underlined a lot of things that meant something to me at one particular time. And then you go back through and you think, well, this other verse is speaking to me a lot more than the one I'd underlined. So I find that to be interesting, you know, because it becomes new in a different way.
Well, we'll discover as we go forward in the coming months that different biblical passages really sang and translated and spoke in certain times and contexts, and then in other times and contexts, they didn't have nearly the punch. A most obvious example that comes to mind right now is the way that the Exodus narrative was read and held by slaves in America, and how that became, right along with the gospel narrative, their story in a way that I've never been able to connect with half so well. It had everything to do with the place in life and the time in history they were approaching the biblical text. And we'll talk more about that too, because it helps us understand some of the confusing passages in their own context so that they're not as much of a conundrum today. But I'll go ahead and move on to my Bible story, my journey with the Bible. I cannot remember a time before I was aware of the Bible, nor can I remember a time before I was being, immersed in the stories of the Bible. My dad in the evening would punch his finger in the air and say, "Bible, story time," which meant that all of the kids, me, my brother and sister, we had to stop what we were doing, turn off the video games if we were playing video games, or turn off whatever we were watching in the evening, and we had to sit around and listen to Bible stories. And this was something that happened from the time I probably was 3 or 4. I don't remember when it started. And it continued on until I was a teenager, 16, 17, to the point where I had enough autonomy to where I would opt out. And that was a big point of contention. But that was what we did. And then it would be concluded with a family prayer where we would pray in turn, starting from the youngest to the oldest. And by the time it got to my dad, he'd have his face buried in the armchair, and you could barely hear him, just sort of mumble, 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 mumble. And he would sometimes fall asleep. So you'd hear this long pause, and his kids would be looking around saying, "So what do we do about this?" And then all of a sudden he'd wake up and eventually he'd finish the prayer. So like God was all of the time. Bible was all of the time. And I was told, and this is probably something that will be familiar to you, that the Bible was, broken down into an acronym, basic instructions before leaving Earth. It's very cute and convenient and succinct. And for me as a child, what I heard most was basic and leaving Earth. I know that most people mean before we leave the earth, but for me, it placed God at a far distance. And the Bible, on an intuitive level, I understood to be the conduit by which I would approach God, knowledge about God, instructions for my own life. I guess the word instructions here also loomed large as I would continue to read. So I'll break that down as I understood it. I tried to put myself back in my childhood self and use adult words to describe what I think was going on in my head. So basic, simple, easy to grasp, I was told, which, as we've been discussing, it's not always the case. But as a child, I remember being told that the Bible was basically broken down to the least common denominator. You just read it and you'll understand it. And people say this about the Bible to this very day. It's one of the, I would call it a myth about the Bible that really doesn't do us a service. And then instructions. These are principles to live by. Larry mentioned Leviticus, and so I will ask, not really ask as a rhetorical question, you know, what kind of instructions are you applying from that book? But I was under the impression these are the do's. What's that? We'll get more into that in a second. But
Yeah, I think you should stick to the New Testament basic instructions.
Well, we'll get on that later. Let's just say that when Jesus quoted the scriptures, he always quoted the Hebrew Bible, old passages and more current prophetic passages. I think that I have a book that we're going to be not going over, but it will be a source material where it's called "Do We Need the New Testament?" And of course, the author's answer is yes, but his point is that Jesus in many ways was a living embodiment of the messaging of the Old Testament. But more on that in a second. I would like, I appreciate the comment, and I don't want to well, anyway, that's a theme that we'll talk about in the weeks and months to come. But instructions, right? There's very clear do's and don'ts. Then before, this places the Bible back in a fixed point of time. All that we need to know, I thought, was laid out way back when, and that there's nothing more needed in the present. And then leaving Earth. So, as I said earlier, God basically absent. And our one point of contact for me as a child, I thought, was this ancient book, and then maybe prayer. But prayer was also frustrating to me in some ways. So I was told, this, by the way, is a picture of the exact Bible that I was given as a kid. It's the King James Version, which they believed was the version to have. And so that was what I was reading in elementary school. And I was told, along with my peers, that I needed to be reading my Bible daily, that if I didn't, I would never come to know God. In fact, not reading my Bible was framed as an act of defiance against God. And so I read. So picture, if you can, a third grade version of Heath reading into the night until his eyes burned. And I'm speaking quite literally, night after night. I'd finish a chapter and I'd wonder if God would be okay with me going to sleep. Unsure if I had read enough, so I'd plow right ahead. And this would have been fine if my reading into the night had led to some sort of clarity as to what God expected of me. Some stories seemed to offer guidance, especially as they were framed in my Sunday school, but other parts of the Bible just confused me or saddled me with guilt. And I mean, I read through in the King James, the Old Testament and the New Testament before I got out of elementary school. And I remember one time a cousin noticing my bookmark placed somewhere in 1st or 2nd Kings in the Bible. And I was maybe in 4th or 5th grade. And I didn't understand a lot of what I read, but guilt drove me to it. And he asked if I read that far, and I said, yeah. And he thought I was lying. But my devotion was that, consistent. But I'll show you a few of the examples of Bible passages that I can remember I found puzzling. I tried to pick ones that I could say, honestly, I remembered from this time in my life. I remember plowing through Leviticus and reading things like, you shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your animals breed with a different kind. So 3rd grade version of Heath says, okay, that's weird. You shall not sow your field with 2 kinds of seed. I'd look out in my front yard, and my dad has a garden with corn knee-high alongside tomatoes and lettuce and peas. And I thought, well, that seems to be against the Bible. Nor shall you put on a garment made of 2 different kinds of materials, which basically excludes most t-shirts or most garments that I've probably worn in my lifetime. Thus saith the Lord. So I began to wonder if I was living in disobedience.
Terrible.
Right. Well, the holiness code, it will talk about probably in the distant, not too distant future, but not too immediate future. There is a point to these kinds of keeping 2 kinds of things, different kinds of things apart. It was meant to serve as a metaphor for Israel's oneness as a nation, right, and oneness with God. And so this was like a daily practice, an example to remind, just like the clouds being a shield of God's faithfulness as a reminder. This was meant to remind the Israel people that there was one God and they were their children. And so understood in that light, well, you can kind of understand, but for a 3rd grader, 4th grader reading it, it was just confusing. Leviticus as well, chapter 13. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when a person has on the skin of his body a swelling or an eruption or a spot, and it turns into a leprous disease on the skin in his body, he shall be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons the priests. The priest shall examine the disease on the skin of his body, and if the hair in the diseased area is turned white, and the disease appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is leprous disease. After the priest has examined him, he shall pronounce him ceremonially unclean. Does anyone recognize that plant I have there?
Like
Poison ivy.
Yes, Poison
Yes.
ivy. There was poison ivy, you better believe, in my backyard. And when I got a skin disease, I'd have passages like this in the back of my mind wondering exactly what I ought to do about it. And then there's this, Jim. Me and my brother used to argue about this passage.
My brother-in-law.
My brother and I appreciate it. Appreciate it.
Sorry, teacher.
No, it's good for me. It's good for me. My brother and I used to argue about this. This is found in 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 23 through 25. And it reads, he being Elijah, went up from there to go to Bethel. And while he was going up on the way, some small boys came out of the city and jeered at him, saying, "Go away, bald head. Go away, bald head." When he turned around and saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 she-bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the boys. From there, he went on to Mount Carmel and then returned to Samaria. So that's a lot to take in. But I would argue with my brother about this, especially early in college, where I would say, "Brent, this is just a terrible story." And he'd say, "Well, it's really about the dignity of the prophet." And I'd say, "Well, if this did happen, I hope it's God on a bad day. And I hope it's the prophet on a bad day. And if it's a metaphor, couldn't we have a better metaphor?" And of course, we would just go around in circles and circles as we would try to figure out in what way this text could have something life-giving to offer us. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So, but wait, isn't it just an Old Testament problem? Well, and you see this graphic, right? Some way that it's presented. Ephesians 6, 5 through 8. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, in singleness of heart, as you obey Christ, not only while being watched and in order to please them, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Render service with enthusiasm as to the Lord, and not to men and women, knowing that whatever good we do, we will receive the same again from the Lord, whether we are slaves or free. Now, this passage might, for a slave in that time, where the institution of slavery in Rome was not something people were thinking outside of at the time, be seen as an elevating passage. But in the context of European slave trade, passages like this specifically were used to sanction and reinforce the idea that slavery was a divine institution set up by God. Of course, there's a parable that Jesus told in Matthew 24 about a man that didn't show up to the party in the right way. And it says that he being the God figure in the parable, will cut him into pieces and put him with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then, of course, I've got this picture here where you have he being Jesus, far apart from the gentle as a lamb, suffer the children to come to me kind of guy. We have him clothed in a robe dripped in blood. His name, the Word of God. The armies of heaven wearing fine linen behind him, pure and white, following him on white horses. And he would go to slaughter the unbelievers at the gates of Jerusalem. So we have a lot to not only process, but have a conversation with, and try to discover together as believers, not just us here in this digital space, but the church broadly speaking, how these passages were understood in their own time and what they have to say to us today, or not to get ahead of myself. So keep in mind, I was soaking all of this in from an early age at Sunday school, vacation Bible school, junior Bible camp, teen camp, family camp, and at family devotions. And the basic message was hammered home that it's simple, easy to grasp. As I said earlier, these are principles to live by, and this is your way of connecting to and understanding God. So the big question that I was left with, that left me disillusioned in my probably middle school to early teen years, at the time where I actually lost faith for a time, was, if the Bible is the self-evident instruction of God, why would a child's attempt to be faithful be met with so much guilt, confusion, and frustration? And my answer is that the problem lies in the assumptions I brought to the reading assumptions about the Bible and how it was meant to speak to me. And the Bible does sometimes speak out of both sides of its mouth. For example, and this is, Sue alluded to this earlier, sometimes it tells the story twice and in different ways. The flooding account, Genesis 6, verses 16 through 22. In that account, Noah takes two of every kind of creature, male and female, into the ark, making no distinction between the clean and the unclean. But in Genesis chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, Noah is instructed to take 7 pairs of clean animals and only 1 pair of the unclean animals. In 2 Kings, chapter 16, verse 20, the king Ahaz is clearly buried in Bethlehem. But in 2 Chronicles 28, verses 27, the same king Ahaz is buried in Jerusalem. Now there's a socio-political reason for that, based on who's telling the story. But this is an inconsistency. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is throwing the money changers out of the temple. Is one of the last things he does after his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. While in John's gospel, it is one of the very first things that he does, which makes you wonder, John's gospel written last, why it was placed at the front end of Jesus's ministry when the other 3 earlier gospels have it on the back half. And there's a reason that John had for that, but that's months ahead at this point. And then this quote from a book called Reading the Bible for All the Wrong Reasons, written by Russell Prajand. He's a biblical scholar and a Christian who loves the scriptures. But he writes, regarding theological differences, the books of Job and Ecclesiastes stand in considerable tension with central motifs in other writings. Job questions a notion that pervades in books of Joshua through 2 Kings and is found in different forms in Proverbs, that God rewards the good and punishes the evil in this life. That's a dominant theme of those books just listed. But throughout the story of Job, Job disputes that view, denying that he has brought his suffering upon himself through sin. But Job's friends argue with him on behalf of the standard theology, contending that his sufferings are indeed a result of his sin. Now, I'm cutting in here to say that Job's friends are actually voicing what their Bibles say. But then in the book of Job, a different biblical verse, a biblical book that we hold, in our Old Testament alongside all of these others, God confronts Job's friend, I'm quoting again, Eliphaz, with this blistering indictment that clearly rejects that theology. My wrath is kindled against you and your 2 friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. And in Ecclesiastes, we find statements such as in chapter 7, verse 15, that are even more direct in dissenting from the standard doctrine. Quote, in my vain life I have seen everything. There are righteous people who perish in their righteousness, and there are wicked people who prolong their life in evil doing. Which is a theological claim, this is Heath talking now, that seems to stand over and against beliefs that are very basic to some of the Jewish and Christian faith, that to those who are faithful, God will give some sort of reward. And so my point is not to say which one of these statements are right, but to say that both are voiced in the scriptures, in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, both perspectives. And then one of my favorite differences, because of my own interactions with it, is found in the book of Acts. And I'm not going to say who it was, not my brother, who I've long kind of poked. We've had fun discussions about this reality. But in the book of Acts, you have Saul's conversion with the blinding light, Acts chapter 9, and then Acts chapter 22. And the question, could people riding along with Saul see the blinding light and not hear the voice that he met him on the road? Or could they hear the voice and not see the light? And the answer, even in the book of Acts, is both. The story is told twice, one from a narrative perspective and one from the perspective of Paul telling his own story. In Acts chapter 9, verse 7, it reads, the men who were traveling with him stood speechless because they heard the voice but saw no one. Then in 22, verse 9, he's telling the story to try to convince people to accept the gospel. And he says of his story, now those who were with me saw the light, but did not hear the voice of the one who was speaking to me. So somebody who I dearly love, when presented with this dilemma, said, well, I think it's both. Some of them saw the light and heard the voice, and some heard the voice and saw the light, depending on which one you were talking to. And I thought, well, okay. So it turns out that the voices in the Bible are as diverse and varied as the communities that still value them today. You can either lean into that reality or resist it. But if you resist it, you will find yourself practicing cognitive dissonance, just ignoring that two things seem to be in conflict or are in conflict. You will twist uncomfortable passages to fit your assumptions about God, or you will simply ignoring what you do not like. And for the record, I've tried all of these methods, and I bent my head and heart in different shapes to get all of the pieces to fit. And it was an exhausting and soul-crushing experience. And what's more, it caused me to distance myself from the Bible for some years. And I'll add, I hear some of that in what you have said about your journey with the Bible, where as you're trying to find one singular voice speaking through the Bible, you found a variety of perspectives, and this left you confused. So, important point. This is why I believe so many in our culture today do not engage the Bible or find it troubling. But are there other time-tested ways to engage the Bible? What I mean is ways older than our modern assumptions about the Bible, the assumptions we've carried out of the 19th century and into the 20th century. And it turns out there are. In fact, history provides us a variety of time-tested approaches that only fell out of favor in North America, specifically in the late 19th and 20th century, and carry on into today. And so the perspectives I'm about to lay out are old. Some of them are older than Jesus. And then I'll give an overview of how we got to where we are today. One was mentioned earlier by Judy. It's called the Tradition of Midrash, where you were amazed that people would kind of argue with the scripture and try to find out what God wanted to say to them that day about from the Bible story. And so to revisit that story of Elijah and the bear, that's basically what my brother and I have been doing for years, although he's kind of come around to my way of thinking in more recent times. But we were taking a Bible story, and we were basically saying, one of us, I think that's just really troubling. And then another one of us saying, well, I think there's some beauty in it. And then if you could imagine a third or fourth voice there saying, well, here's my perspective and here's my perspective. And together, as you engage the story, you come to a clearer understanding of who that community who are speaking about it understand God to be. And commentary on these passages has become known as the Midrash, which has been the writing down of these centuries of back and forth and dialogue, where it's okay to stand in contention with the stories and to even argue with the God images you find there in hopes to better understand the God that you believe in. And so you would take the God of some of the passages in Isaiah, where God is compassionate and cares for those who have been sorely put upon, the immigrant, the refugee, the vulnerable, and you would hold it up against the God of, say, that you'd find in the Torah, although that God of Isaiah is also in the Torah. There's sometimes God in the Torah asking the people to basically commit genocide. And that discussion is what shapes your understanding of God. And so in that way, those passages still speak to you. And this is a tradition that predates Jesus by hundreds of years. And you can see Jesus doing it in passages like Luke chapter 4, where he opens the scripture, the scroll, and reads from the book of Isaiah, and then throws them a curveball and says, today the scripture is revealed in your hearing. And then the room erupts, but that's kind of part of the tradition of the argumentation, the investigation, bearing out the truth. So that's a very old way, and a way that was utilized throughout the history of the church, up until more recent centuries. Another thing you have to understand about the original people who were receiving scripture, telling the stories before they were written down, and also hearing them and interpreting them, is that they were not looking at the stories through the same lens, historical as an academic, history as an academic science lens that we do today. So if we're trying to discover who shot Kennedy, right? We want the facts. We want to find out exactly who was there and where they were, and we want to, like, through the best of our knowledge of historical record keeping and photo analysis, get to the absolute truth. And historians in the 19th century began to, as modernism, which is something we'll talk about here in a second, began to really get underway, boiled down history to this sort of science where you wanted to get to the absolute literal fact. But that, as a science, did not exist until very recently. And so people hearing these stories, like say you told them the story of Jonah and the whale, and a modern historian wanted to chime in and say, well, can you prove it? They're like, why would you try to prove it? That's not the point. The point is the story and what it tells us about God. Like the question is to his historicity, whether it was true or wasn't true, wasn't the point. And our bringing our modern lens as it relates to history telling and historical record and historical archives is a fairly modern phenomenon, and not one that was on the radar of the people who were putting the Bibles together, the scriptural passages together that we now are trying to understand. And then also another tool that is an old tool that I think will help us going forward is that a parabolic understanding, as in parables, parabolic understanding of the scriptures was intuitive to the original audiences. And so modern audiences only tune into parables when Jesus says something like, when the text says, Jesus then spoke to him in this parable. They're like, okay, now this is a parable. But parabolic understandings were assumed and intuitive as they heard stories. And so what you see here in the slide is a few pictures that depict the story of Lazarus, the poor man, who died outside of a rich man's house. And they both find themselves on either side of Sheol, one in Abraham's bosom, one in the fiery pit. And I remember the discussions about this passage growing up were like, here is a literal depiction of heaven and hell. Like one place you're going to be hugged by Abraham, and the other place you're going to be in this sort of fiery pit. And the original hearers of the parable would have been said, like, what are you talking about? It's about greed. It's about the fire and anguish and torment that the greedy way of life leads a person towards. And so this sort of parabolic understanding as it brought to Jesus's parables and even older stories would have been intuitive. And this was demonstrated to me in a Bible class in seminary with the following parable. He said, so there was one day a donkey walking down the road, and he came to a fork in the road, and there was a carrot on the left side and there was an apple on the right side. And the donkey was so confused as to which it wanted, it couldn't make up its mind. It literally tore itself in half in pursuit of both things at once. And my professor turned to the class and said, is this a true story? And I'll throw the question to you today. Is that a true story? Yes, because greed will rip you. Yes, because greed will rip you in half. You see? It's the question of
What
like,
is a parable story teaching then?
what's that?
Physically, it's not possible, but emotionally, or I don't know another word to say, even spiritually, yes, it's possible.
You got it. And these would have been seen as the main point of the stories in the Bible. Some of them are unabashedly trying to record an historical record, like we were talking about Chronicles, as in chronicling, or First and Second Kings, clearly. But the whole point as to like the absolute accuracy, like they would not have been bent up out of shape about whether or not Ahaz was buried in Bethlehem or was buried in Jerusalem, unless you had a vested interest in where the capital should be. Then it become an issue, right? Because if Jerusalem is your preferred city and where the seat of power and religious life is anchored, then him being buried in Jerusalem becomes very important. But that the significance, the symbolic meaning was what carried the day, which isn't to say that history doesn't matter. Of course it matters. But we we cut ourselves off from a lot of what the Bible has to teach us because we, approaching it through our modern lens, find some of the stories has historical accounts wholly pretty far-fetched. And I think that's what a lot of people just don't even try to bother with it because they think that they can only approach it through the lens of modernism. So more on modernism. As modernism shaped the approach of the scientists and the historians as they searched for the unvarnished, imperfect truth, the Bible interpreters were also influenced. And so you had scientists in the 1800s and 1900s inspired by the Enlightenment's vision for a world ordered by reason, who thought that you could come to a perfect understanding of everything. So like the scientists believed they would finally understand every single facet of the earth and creation. They thought of it as a machine that you could get to know every part. And then once you knew every part, you could order it in the most utopian type way. And historians were searching for truth in that historic accuracy in that exact same way, the unvarnished, perfect reading of history. And the readers of the Bible began to look for the Bible to speak into our lives in the same way. The final answer, irrefutable, over and over again, over and against the discoveries being made at that time. So some biblical interpreters began to look for the same kind of answers that biologists, historians, and earth scientists were looking for, but only in the Bible. And they were looking for answers to questions that had only recently been raised, were not ancient questions that the writers of the Bible were even raising. In fact, answers the Bible was never trying to answer. So what you got was the sort of thing that you see on your left. This is a little chart of the earth as described quite literally by the Bible. I have even seen flat earthers today who believe in the flat earth theory or flat earth myth, who got to their understanding of flat earth based off their reading of the Bible. So if you take the Genesis creation accounts and then some things that are said later in the Bible, what you get is a flat earth with an underworld, pillars holding it up, because that's mentioned, I think, in the book of Job. You've got a firmament, right, which is this dome that holds it all up. Then you've got an ocean, the waters where God would have been hovering over. So again, you look at a chart like this and you kind of scratch your head and say, aren't you kind of missing the point? So then you had, and you know what, I'm getting ahead of myself because I should go also back and explain the way that the Bible began to be understood during the time of the Reformation, right? You've heard of Martin Luther and the 95 Theses on the wall, in the year 1517, trying to reform the papacy and the Catholic Church. And at that time, the Catholic Church in Europe, I mean, there's another history going on into the East with the Orthodox and other parts of the world, in Egypt and other places where Christianity were developing along different lines. But in Europe, you had one authoritative voice, and that was the Pope. But when you throw the Pope off and the papacy, and you're creating something new, and it's becoming more and more fractured, what was wanted was one authoritative voice to speak in a similar way that the papacy used to speak. And what the reformers, the conclusion they arrived at, whether it be Luther and then later Calvin, Luther Zwingli, and all kinds of Protestant reformers, was that the Bible was that thing. So they elevated it above traditions that had been previously elevated above the scriptures. And that is how we came to this sort of understanding that the Bible is the only place where we find God speaking. So all that to say, you combine that with the reaction to modernism, where we begin to try to find the same sort of certitude in the Bible that the scientists were finding in their test tubes. And then you arrive at what is now known as, in a blanket term, postmodernism. And postmodernism is where we find ourselves today. And almost the critique of postmodernism is beginning, and it is a very divisive term. Some people really lean into it and appreciate a postmodern perspective, and others really find it.
Sound.
What's that? Oh, find it very disorienting. Basically, after World War II, society was disillusioned with the promises of modernism. They had been promising for about a century that we would finally understand everything and order everything in the perfect way, and then the atomic bomb, and then the Vietnam War. And so people began to question everything, even the modern assumptions about what was real, what was not real, about what was historical, ahistorical. And it led to some quite absurd places where people didn't believe you could believe anything about anything. But as it's come around full circle, it means that when we do approach what is, try to find out what is really real, whether in nature or about God or anything, we approach it with a great deal of humility, understanding that our perspective is our perspective, and another's perspective is different, and that in one way we are each approaching the reality, the deep truths that we believe are fixed and true, but from a different interpretive lens, and that we'll never see the whole of it. So it's illustrated kind of by this comic, one of my favorites, Calvin and Hobbes, when he's asked what important event took place on December 16th, 1773. And he writes, "I do not believe in linear time. There is no past and future. All is one, and existence is the temporal sense, in the temporal sense is illusory. This question, therefore, is meaningless and impossible to answer." And he writes, "When in doubt, deny all terms and definitions," which was quite a knee-jerk reaction. And postmodernism is leaving this perspective and saying, well, we can understand some things. We just have to take into account our cultural lens, our own experiences, and approach these topics with a great deal of humility. So the result of all of this, and I think why so many people find the Bible inaccessible, is because there are still those who cling to a modernist, literalist, one-size-fits-all interpretive lens, and are making the Bible far from accessible for many would-be readers today. But there are some who, with the disillusionment after modernity or modernism, who are rediscovering the old ways. And so back to this Midrash tradition, where we argue with it. We might read Psalm 137, where it begins with, "I sat by the banks of Babylon and wept," but then ends with the author wanting to bash the Babylonians' babies' heads against rocks. We could say, wow, I appreciate the homesickness and the anger and the despair, but also acknowledge that result, that angry, that vitriol will have to be something that humanity works past. Where we can go back and remember a time before history was a time when history was not an academic science, where stories were held in tension, and that was okay, and what they mean is more important than nailing down all the facts. Then, of course, coming back to a parabolic understanding where that is more or less intuitive, and so trying to find out if the story of Lazarus, the parable of Lazarus, is describing the afterlife, if that's the point, or what if it is a warning about greed, using powerful imagery. And then a quote by the late Rachel Held Evans. Unfortunately, she died last year of a complication to a surgery, actually. She writes in her book called Inspired, "When you stop trying to force the Bible to be something it's not, static, perspicacious, certain, absolute, then you're free to revel in what it is, living, breathing, confounding, surprising, and yes, perhaps even magic. The ancient rabbis likened scripture to a palace alive and bustling, full of grand halls, banquet rooms, secret passages, and locked doors." And so in the coming months, we will be revisiting the Bible in hopes to understand it as it has been understood through the centuries. But also, we'd like to learn how it was read and understood in its original context. And so those things I've kept talking about, who wrote these books, what were they trying to convey, and in what ways has God met the people in these stories, poems, songs, and sayings? And most importantly for us, I think, what do they still have to teach us today? And so we'll open it up to questions here in a second, but I want to point to where we're going next week. Next week, we will talk about when the Bible was written. And I mean like an overview of all the books, how it may surprise you that the book of Genesis was compiled later than a lot of what we read in the Old Testament. So we'll find out the process and how this was put together. We'll talk about the biblical divisions, the Old and New Testaments, the Torah, prophets, writings, histories, epistles, gospels, and the apocalyptic books, and how the Bible took its current form, councils and canonization, Reformation and recalibration after the Reformation, and then an overview of the Torah, the books of Moses, the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which I think will set us up for really beginning at Genesis and working our way through those. And another quote from Rachel Held Evans: "My journey back to loving the Bible, like most journeys of faith, is a meandering and ongoing one, a story still in draft. And like all pilgrims, I am indebted to those who have gone before me, those saints of holy curiosity, whose lives of faithful questioning taught me not to fear my doubts, but to embrace and learn from them." So bring us back into the room and see what sort of conversation that deluge that I just threw at you might have sparked.
Comment, Heath.
Yeah.
Well, it's not really a question, but when you were talking about the American experience with the Bible and that happened related to the late 19th, early 20th century, and my mind said, oh yeah, that was when fundamentalism hit the scene, and how that had a impact on
They go together.
Yeah.
The fundamentalist was a reaction to modernism using the modernist lens. So if the scientists were trying to get to the root of all truth by careful observation and a collection of data and tying it all together, which, by the way, they've since learned you can't do, although science gets you somewhere, it doesn't get you all the answers. The response within Christian circles that were threatened by these developments, not all were, and many of the great scientists and biologists have been Christians, but those that were threatened by it took the Bible and treated it as if they basically took the scientific method into the scriptures and tried to get it to speak as in a unified voice, like the scientists were trying to speak from their own fields of study. And so then you get these arguments that are still going on today, although they're kind of fading in the background, most obviously around things like evolution or the creation accounts, where you have this real sticking point of contention where the fundamentalists believe that if you don't see that absolutely literally, you lose the whole thing, which, as we've been talking, before modernism, the parabolic understanding was dominant as it relates to the first 3 chapters of Genesis. In fact, Hebrew scholars will tell you they are poetry. They're poetry. They're not even narration. They're written with sort of a song in their voice, meant to be recited, to carry deep truths about who we are as humans and how we relate to God. Hey, Bob, are you raising your hand? Well. Are there any other questions or comments?
I'll throw in one more. Speaking of the conflict between the science and the spiritual, I remember I can't remember the source of it, but the person who said science thought it had answers to everything, and then quantum physics came on the scene. And I'll be radical enough to say I suspect quantum physics may be the ultimate connector between faith and material science.
The physicists are sounding more and more spiritual as they learn about the way the universe works in terms of numbers, and it's And then people who have been reading the biblical script traditions from a spiritual perspective are like, like, we couldn't get on board when the fundamentalists were trying to, prove that the sun stopped for one day in Earth's history. But what it is saying about the complexities of creation and the spiritual, like the awe, the beatific vision that physicists tell us they see in their numbers, then it's like comes around full circle. As I was going through my material that I find very interesting myself, I realized that it could have been perhaps too dense. Is that something any of you were experiencing? And don't worry about hurting my feelings. I really, the feedback will help us going forward.
I rather enjoyed it, Eve.
I didn't feel that way. I thought it was fine. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't light up, so okay.
I was very relieved to see that many of you had the same questions and observations that I've had growing up and into my, early adult life. When we get to Revelation, I'll tell you, I only began to be able to enjoy that book 4 or 5 years ago. And so this has been an ongoing process with me in the Bible. And now I have never enjoyed reading the Bible more. What had been a very laborious exercise, largely because of my expectations going in. A youth pastor might say something like, I just spent half hour under the apple tree with my Bible, and it was like fireworks in my heart and in my mind, and I felt like I was transported into the heavens. And then 12-year-old Heath would be like, okay, well, let me give it a try. And I would sit under maybe an oak tree and I would read it, and I would feel like very like, why won't God do that for me, what my youth pastor has promised from, so now I don't know if you've had similar experiences hearing somebody talk about the Bible in that way, but I've also have had moments where I've been moved to tears, where Sue's experience that she described about the clouds being a flag of God's faithfulness, where the Bible has found me in those ways.
Yeah, it's scary. Last night I was reading in Revelations 5, and the verse said, and I mean, I studied Revelation in BFS, so I should have known this, but it totally escaped me at the time. And it says that Jesus has 7 horns and 7 eyes. And I'm thinking, okay, not my picture of Jesus. And so I have to stop and evaluate what these words really mean, that the eyes were just for knowledge, I believe, and the horns are for power. And so that puts a different, horns represent power in Revelations.
Apocalyptic literature was a genre in Judaism, in Jewish writings, that was understood. Like you might pick up a mystery classic, right? This is mystery, or you might pick up science fiction and say this is science fiction. Apocalyptic was a genre, and so you understood immediately that what you were reading was symbolism that related to things in your current context.
Yeah.
So, and they knew that. Now you fast forward into the 1880s, and you get people in the context of modernism trying to take everything absolutely as literal as possible, coming up with what would become the modern readings of Revelation that I found very scary and troubling and confusing as a child. Mm-hmm. And we will get into that. And actually, Revelation, when it's properly understood, is a scathing critique of imperialism, greed, and authoritarian rule that pushes against and is counter to God's intentions and purposes in the world. Now, it's not a crystal ball to see the future, in other words. It was very much set in its context in Rome. I don't want to give, we'll deal with Revelation at a later date. But when it's understood in that light, you can say, so who are the the authoritarian imperialistic forces today consumed by greed? And in what ways do those values not match up with God's values? Of course, it does point towards a future where the heavens and the earth are brought into a new era, a new chapter, when God's values are realized. But yeah, you're onto it. So where did you learn that the horns were power? Where did you read? So you have a commentary or a book or something?
I do have a study Bible that has something. I'm doing a Bible study on Thursday mornings, and I don't know where this lady gets these questions from. But we're doing Ezekiel, and her last questions this time was something like, what does this chapter emphasize when it comes from God's name and character? And I don't see the question I'm looking for, but when I got into looking for it, everything, it was talking about the millennium, and the commentary I was reading on the millennium was saying people are going to die during the millennium. And I thought, how do they know these things? Where do they get these ideas? I don't remember reading anything like that in the Bible, but maybe God's been speaking to them. I don't know.
Keep these questions coming. I'm strongly tempted to answer where the line of thought came into the dialogue fairly recently, meaning about 200 years ago. People began to see it that way, one person in particular. But I'm afraid right now I'm trying to resist going down various rabbit trails, because those, there's a good, well, I got several books here. A good book to read. You know, I don't have the one that's on my mind right now. Anyway, I'll maybe send it to you in an email when I find it. Well, do you have any questions for me that are on your mind that you might want me to consider when putting together future lessons?
Is there any way? Oh,
go ahead.
This is a practical thing. Is there any way for the slideshow to be smaller? The heads all line up on one side, and then
I don't see the heads.
You don't see them? I don't know how I can't, but I don't see all of the slideshow. I don't see the far right.
No. Well, there is a way of minimizing the camera of the person who's talking. So that's what I do when I'm doing the slideshow. I have a little box of a screen where I can see whichever you is picking up sound on your mics, but I just minimize it so I can just see basically my slideshow.
So maybe I need to fool around with this at the bottom or something. They're different.
I saw a plus sign and a negative sign, and the negative sign minimized it. Now, and I will tell you as well, just so you know, going forward, while we are going to cover a lot of ground of history outside of the Bible, when we get into the Bible, we will definitely be immersing into the world of the Bible. And so not all of it is going to have this sort of broad, sweeping academic bent. When we get to the storytelling of the Bible, we will be learning how to hear the stories for what they are, and so my point is it's not going to be this heady, I guess, going forward, because I don't want to. If some people love getting lost in the weeds like I do, and we covered a lot of ground really fast, but I realize it's not for everybody.
We'll just ask you questions and embarrass you, so don't worry about it.
That's good. You should do that. If I don't know one, I'll say I don't know, and I'll try to find it out.
I don't think it'll be a problem.
Well, thank you for joining me here, and I hope that were able to take away something, and we'll be back here 2:00 a week from right now.
Okay, sounds good.
Very good. Thank you.
Bye.
No assignment, huh?
No assignment. No.
Yay! It took me 2.5 hours to do her lesson. A long time.
Yeah, it is.
All right, I'm going to end the meeting now. Bye, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.